right, welcome back filmmakers. This is episode 7 about how to develop your next documentary film. Today we're talking about the all-important proposal and how to write it. Sue, what do you think the key ingredients of a successful proposal are?
Your proposal needs to answer the questions that whoever you're pitching to wants answered.
Yeah, and I think this varies, doesn't it, between who the proposal's going to. There is a very conventional format that we have here in Australia, for example, that screen agencies will require. And often, that format involves things like a short synopsis, bios of the key creatives, budgets, finance templates, and sometimes scripts, depending on what type of film it is. Do you find that you're using those things very much in your proposal writing?
Only time I use that type of information is when I'm applying to an Australian screen agency, and occasionally to film festivals who might have funding attached to them. That's the type of information they might need.
Yeah, ironically, I think a lot of the information that the screen agencies ask for is actually really, how do I say this nicely? It actually would interfere with the chances of a reader of a proposal, for example, an investor actually giving you the green light. So I think there's way too much information in some of those screen agency requirements that may not be helpful. And I think today we should really focus the discussion on proposal writing for investors.
And when we say investors, the type of investors we're talking about are foundations, philanthropists, not-for-profits, organisations that are aligned with the project that you're creating and that might be interested in financing into the work that you're creating. So we're talking more about private industry as opposed to screen agencies. So that's how, or streaming services or broadcasters. So that's how we sort of define those two in the different buckets.
Yeah, and I think we should also point out that today we're talking about proposals for documentaries, and clearly with narrative feature films, it is quite different. And often the script is all important, and in documentaries, the script, I would say, is less important. So let's talk about the elements of a successful investment proposal for documentary. Let's go through them one by one. Firstly, how do we start the proposal?
The first thing that I would do when I am starting a proposal is start a Pages or a Word document and literally bullet point the key topics that I'm going to need to then fill up with information.
So do you start with the story?
You can start with a story. If you're far enough along in your research and development that you've got a really good handle on your story, you could definitely write, I'd say maybe a page on story. The only thing that with documentary I'd be a little wary of there is you don't want to stitch yourself up. So you need to talk about your story in broader terms. You don't want to start getting down to the scene by scene or the 3-act structure or anything like that. You're just talking about your story in this is what you're trying to achieve in your film.
We all know how engaging stories are. That's why we're filmmakers. I would say in documentary filmmaking in particular, stories are often related to topics, things that are happening in the real world. So another option is to start with the topic before you go into the story, because often that's what your reader will be familiar with already.
Which you might just simply title, what's the problem, what's the solution? So then that gives you something to start from there.
Then in terms of the impact that you want to make, in terms of who you're reaching, how you're reaching them, and what you want to happen after they see your film, does that land in your proposal writing process as well?
Absolutely. I think it's really important to know who the audience is for your project, and you need to talk about that in the proposal, because if you're going to, say for example, a philanthropist or a not-for-profit or a foundation, and they're going to want to see that your audience aligns with the audience their work is focused on, and so when there's good crossover, that's how they're going to be interested in the story that you're telling, because it's going to help them progress their mission as well. So understanding who your audience is and talking about that audience is a really important part of the proposal.
In terms of giving the credibility and the confidence to the reader that you know what you're doing in this topic, how much do you bring in imagery and also reference to people you may have pre-interviewed or started attaching to the project?
I would definitely be using as much imagery as you possibly can. Visualise that proposal. I mean, we're filmmakers, and the best way to make a film is by using film. So use links to any pre-interviews that are relevant, or you could create a teaser out of the interviews that you've already created. Anywhere you can visual it up, definitely.
Yeah, so you may have been taking photos during
Yep.
the development process. It's a good place to bring those in, I suppose. All right, the next thing is around budget. So I think I said earlier that I would really advise against including things like itemised budget. And the reason I said that was I think budgets can really easily be torn apart, and they can really easily be torn apart by investors because often they're really good at business. So this is something that screen agencies need, but I would say shouldn't land in an investment proposal. What needs to land in there is something different, isn't it?
Yeah, what you need to do is you need to have the number. What's the number you need to raise? How much money do you need to realise the vision for your film? And that number needs to go into the proposal, but you wouldn't, as you say, break it down into line items. What you'd say is this amount of money will enable us to do pre-production, post-production, and all those elements, but you'd only list the elements. You wouldn't give a dollar amount per element. So you're not giving a breakdown of a budget, you're giving I need this amount of money and this amount of money will enable me to do these activities. And you might actually be raising finance and you are splitting that up. So you might be saying from you, I want X amount of my budget because this other group is going to give me X amount of my budget. And so then they also know who else is funding into the project.
So I think another part of that is what's in it for the investor. How much of what's in it for the investor lands in the proposal?
I think you have to align what your vision is with how that's going to help the investor realise their vision. I do think that's really important. Yeah. How does that synergise? How do those two things come together?
So you're spending time in the proposal talking about the benefits to the potential investor.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think the more detail you can get into that and the more that's tailored to what they're interested in, whether it's a financial return or whether it's some sort of social impact, that needs to get a lot of attention in a successful proposal.
Yeah, because the project that you're making, we specialise in documentary film, impact film, and so the topics of our film might, really help to build the audience online for an investor, and maybe that's really important to them. So they're not necessarily looking to raise finance on the back of it or recoup on their investment in a financial way. They might be looking to recoup on their investment in the way people interact with their organisation going forwards. So there's different ways that you can give benefits to finances.
Look, I think one thing I've noticed with the screen agency requirements is they're often very much about the filmmaker, putting the spotlight on the filmmaker. So there's a lot of questions and information asked about biographies and past work and, the creative approach to the filmmaking process. I actually find that very little of that information ends up in a successful investment proposal. So that we just touch on that. So how much do you think is advisable in terms of going into yourself and your past work and all this kind of stuff?
Look, I think if you're a new filmmaker and you don't have a lot of track record, you do need to show your credibility. You do need to talk about your past work, what you've achieved, what you've produced, why you're a safe bet for them to fund into, why you can be the one to realise this film and make it happen. So I do think you need to have your credibility really prominent so that question about whether you can deliver on your promise is not a concern to them. But that shouldn't be more than, linking out to various films you've made and a couple of paragraphs. It's, you should be able to do that quite succinctly.
With proposals I've been involved in, I often put that information right towards the end. And that's partly out of respect for the reader. So trying to make the start of the proposal, the main focus area of the proposal about them and what they're interested in. And you're right, they are interested in you and they do need to know about your credibility. But I think that is probably better placed down towards the tail end of a successful proposal. So when we're talking about proposals, we've already identified how important it is to keep the reader in mind. But I suppose the tone of the writing is quite important here as well in terms of how specific it is if there's a lot of filmmaking terms in there, or if it's more of a general take. Do you have a view on this?
I do. I think it's about knowing who you're pitching to and who that proposal's going to land in front of. And this is where creating versions of the proposal that are tailored to whomever you're sending it to is really helpful, because I don't think you do want to get too film language, and I don't think you want to get too technical, because you don't really know if the reader at the other end is going to understand that terminology or in language, or, you know, it's better to kind of go with lay terms and be a bit more general in those terms.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And I think this is more an observation on life, but also relates to this successful proposal writing. If you assume knowledge and the person that you're communicating with doesn't have that knowledge, that can create a huge barrier to being able to engage them. They may feel a bit embarrassed that they don't actually know what you're talking about. So I would suggest almost going the other way, which is I'm going to take you on a journey and assume that you may not know much at all about what I'm talking to you about. Even though that the reader might be very knowledgeable in this area in terms of who I'm pitching to, I don't think that they're going to hold that against you, particularly if the story starts from not having assumed knowledge, but then may take you on a journey to where there are really profound insights or aspirations for the project in terms of what change you're going to make in the world. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes back to that old expression, you don't want to tell someone how to suck eggs.
Right.
You know, if they're an expert or they're a leading organisation in the field that your documentary is about, they're going to know more than you. There is no point in trying to pretend that you know more than them. And as soon as you do that, you're in some pretty difficult ground to build rapport, because nobody likes to be told what they already know. But as a documentary filmmaker, your whole role is to explore the topic. So they are going to assume that you're on a learning journey, and they're not going to be concerned if you don't know everything. In fact, they're going to assume you're coming to them because you don't know everything. So I think it's a better way. I absolutely agree. It's way better to take them on a journey that you're on a journey to discover, and they're helping you on that journey, definitely.
And the beauty of this is, I think intuitively as filmmakers, you already know this. The audience brings their own experience to the films that you make. And often you'll remind yourself in the filmmaking process, I'm overriding this. You know, this is a conversation we have a lot. They don't need all of that information. It's the same in the filmmaking process. We don't need to be, you know, so prescriptive about telling them all of this information, because they're going to bring their own experience to that. It's the same with the proposal writing. You know, you want to leave some gaps there that they can fill in for themselves. So you don't need to tell them everything. You don't need to tell them how to suck eggs, absolutely. But leave a little space for their imagination as well.
Yeah, and then they can feel like they can also meaningfully contribute, and that's a really good starting point.
Yeah, they will join the dots for you if you give them enough of the key information. The thing I'd add to this is, I suppose we're at a position in our careers now where we're not only writing proposals, but we're actually receiving them. And I have noticed that more often than not, I receive proposals and they are dense, full of words on a blank sheet of paper, you know, so it's a lot of words on a page. I really struggle with this because I'm quite a visual person, and having big slabs of text is a huge turn off for me. How important do you think visualing it up is?
I think the more visual your proposal is, the better. And okay, maybe the screen agencies don't care about that, but if you're pitching to anything outside of the screen agencies or broadcasters or the streamers, you've got to make it a really attractive proposal. And that means lots of pictures, big bold headlines, make it really clear the way that you set it out, every section nicely laid up. You can do it so easily in Canva if you don't have the budget to go out to a graphic designer. I mean, on Fiverr you can find some pretty reasonable priced graphic designers, but if you can't do that, get into Canva. I mean, you can make some really good proposals in there.
Yeah, well, and a lot of the filmmakers watching this will have a subscription to things like Creative Cloud.
Yep.
You know, and they also have some graphic design programs in there which can be helpful for this type of thing.
Yep.
But it sounds like you're saying take the time to make it as visual as possible. Is that
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Just just think about yourself as a reader. How do you consume written content? Do you find it easier when it's broken up more like a blog with big headlines and shorter paragraphs and visually interesting, great imagery that complements what you're reading? All of those elements make it a much more effective proposal.
I think as filmmakers, it's really important to try and get the reader to also become a viewer. So most successful investment proposals will include at least one film embedded within them as a hyperlink. And you can set up Vimeo if you're publishing to Vimeo so that you can actually be notified if someone's watched that link, which can be really quite helpful because you can kind of figure out who's watching it, who might be more interested, who might have been sharing that film. Might sound a little bit sneaky, but it's not, you don't know anything about who's watching the film, but you do know that it's being watched, and that can be really helpful in terms of figuring out if you're getting traction with your market approaches.
Yeah, definitely. So I think if you can incorporate all of those key elements we've just talked about, you're going to have a much more successful proposal than if you just create, a 2-minute pitch video and hope for the best. So to start with, your proposal is going to start off with what's the film you're making, be that what's the problem, what's the solution, how you're going to tell that story and why you're the person to tell that story.
The next bit's going to be about the audience you're aiming to reach, how you plan to reach them, meaning what types of outputs you're creating, where they'll be released, and what type of impact that's going to make, whether it's a financial return, numbers of audience members reached, or changing behaviour in some way.
Then you need to talk about how much money you're trying to raise and how you will spend that money. So just the overview of what's the ask you're asking of this investor.
And rounding it out with some information about you and your team, remembering that filmmaking is a team sport, so there should be multiple people in your team featured in that section, and also touching on the credibility or track record in producing similar types of films.
And then how the project you're creating relates to the work of the organisation you're asking for finance, and what are the synergies between your project and the work that they do.
So what should these guys do next if they're interested in this topic?
So you could go to one of our other videos, which was 3 questions funders will always ask you. That could be really helpful in when you're thinking about what to answer inside your proposal. And the other thing you can do is head over to moonshinecommunicationsacademy.com, because we'll put a check sheet to go with this episode that you can download to help you refresh on how to actually put a proposal together. So that's at www.moonshinecommunicationsacademy.com.